Hey guys, Zach here with Minimalscapes, and today I want to talk to you guys about substrate. So substrate is super important to your tank. It's pretty much the first thing that you put in, and it's what I would consider the first building block in a tank. And deciding what substrate is right for the tank is super important, but when you go to the store and you've got, 20 different options, it can be super hard to decide. I also found it super tricky to pick which substrate I wanted. So today I want to help you guys out, and I'll explain the pros and cons of what I think the general types of substrate are. So let's get into it. Starting off, we have with what I think is the most popular substrate across the entire aquarium hobby, not just in aquascaping, and that's going to be gravel. Now, gravel can be anything, it can be naturalistic pea gravel or small gravel or even the bright colored gravel that is plastic and sold in the big bags. Now, all of these are going to act pretty similar. Obviously, some gravels are going to be made of rock while others are made of plastic. The plastic ones are going to be inert, whereas the rock ones, depending on the type of rock that they are made of, you can have some water parameter changes with the gravel. An example of this is if I put in pea gravel, which is primarily like river rock sort of makeup, which is a limestone base, it can affect the water and lower the pH, putting more calcium into the water. But overall, most gravels are going to act pretty similarly. So let's go over the pros and cons. Starting off with the pros of gravel, there are a couple that I want to go over. The first is just going to be availability, right? Any pet store you walk into, you can probably find some aquarium gravel. And personally, I prefer going with a substrate than no substrate, so this is always a good option. Right? Even if it is colored, but if you're in a pinch, it could work. Number two, with gravel is the total surface area of the gravel. Right? As each grain goes together, you're still going to have water flow through the gravel as long as it's big enough. With that kind of setup, you're going to have beneficial bacteria growing on the surface of the gravel. So you are going to have a substrate that can take a little bit more waste and deal with some of the negative effects that you do get when you have fish, so it will sort of balance out the tank over time. Another pro of gravel is if you're looking to do water changes regularly and you're fine with gravel siphoning, then gravel is a good choice because it does hide some of the waste from the fish. It'll all sink down into the bottom, and that's going to hide some. So if you're doing a tank that's more display-like, gravel can be a good option because even if you do get behind on the maintenance, generally you're not going to be able to see all of the waste that accumulates in the gravel. Moving to the negatives of gravel is, the first one is the same as the last one for our pros. You can have waste that's going to sink into the bottom of the gravel, and while it's going to look fine, you might not see it, it's still going to be there, and that can create those nitrates and nitrites that are going to eventually lead your water chemistry down a bad path and could kill off your inhabitants. Another con to gravel is just overall weight of the gravel. Well, it's not super crazy heavy. It is something that I do like to take into account when building a tank is, how much weight is this gravel going to have? Should I do a really thick layer of it if I'm going to build tons and tons of hardscape in a tank? The last thing about gravel that I'm not too sold on is with some of the bigger ones or some of the more rugged gravels that aren't perfectly smooth, you can run into problems with planting. I know I have. If you just use your tweezers and try to poke it in, it really doesn't work and plants will come up. I've also found that plants kind of struggle getting through the gravel just because of how heavy it is compared to some other substrates. But overall, I would say gravel is definitely a good choice if you're thinking about substrate, but it's not what I consider to be the best. Our second substrate on the list is going to be sand. Now, I'm quite fond of sand, and there are a bunch of reasons why I truly love it. So, going over the pros is just, again, same as gravel, is the ease of purchasing. Almost every store that I've ever gone to that has any form of pets and fish and tanks will usually have sand. Generally, it's sand and gravel. Those are the basic starters. Sand as well as gravel does come in a variety of colors. You know, you can get your natural color, you can get white, you can get black, you can get a whole range of colored sand if that's what you're really into. Another thing that I do like about sand is how easy it is to plant into. As long as you have a good depth of sand, you're not going to struggle with planting your plants. It's super easy. Once it's filled, you just plug the plant in and the sand basically sucks around it and locks it down. The final pro of sand, unlike gravel, and when I say this, I'm talking about gravel that has a bigger grain so that water can flow through it pretty freely, and sand is the much finer grain stuff that really compacts together. As for the final pro, it's a beneficial bacteria that grows inside of the sand that doesn't grow inside of a lot of gravels. So inside the gravel you still do have oxygen going through the bottom layers of the substrate. You do have that clean water that's able to cycle through. So in that, you do have beneficial bacteria, but it's all aerobic bacteria, which is in the presence of oxygen. Whereas with sand, when you get into the lower layers, you're gonna have anaerobic bacteria, which is bacteria that exists with the lack of oxygen. Now, both of these are beneficial bacteria. However, if you are leaning more towards an ecosystem style tank, you do need anaerobic bacteria as well as aerobic bacteria to complete the nitrogen cycle. Moving on to the negatives of sand, the first one up is going to be waste buildup. Like gravel and any other tank, your substrate is going to be a catch-all for the waste produced in your tank. So say you've got dead leaves, you've got fish waste, you've got maybe a little bit of excess food, it can be tricky to balance that, right? All that waste settles on the bottom. Unlike gravel, however, sand isn't so readily available to catch all that and let it kind of sink in and soak in, right? It takes time for sand to process any of that. So in the meantime though, you can get waste buildup and it can be unsightly. You know, if you're setting up a tank and you want it to be all for appeal, then you do need to be on top of that and not let the waste build up. Another negative that I've found with sand, pretty much exclusively, is due to its flat nature or bright color or whatever it may be, I do find if I get algae in a tank, it'll build up on the sand as well, right? Don't get me wrong, I get algae on rocks, but not so much on the gravel, and then on sand I get lots of algae buildup. The final flaw with sand as well as gravel is there are no nutrients available. If you're starting completely fresh, there's almost no nutrients in sand or gravel. With sand, you can go super deep and maybe get some, but I'd prefer to go to the third substrate, which is a nutrient-based substrate like Aqua Soil or like Fluorite Dark. So the first pro for nutrient-based substrates like Aqua Soil should clearly be that they provide nutrients to your plants in your tank, if you are planning to have plants in your tank. Right? If you're going to have stems, foreground plants, crypts, you name it, you're probably going to want some form of nutrient substrate in your tank. It's just a lot easier than going in with root tabs every 6 months and refreshing the nutrients or making sure that your plants aren't dying. There's a lot more upkeep with other substrates that just is avoided by using something like an Aqua Soil or Fluorite or whatever else you can think of. Right? Another thing that it does is release nutrients into the water column itself. Right? Super important with fish and epiphytes, floating plants, really everything in the aquarium, that there are some free-floating nutrients in the tank, and generally Aqua Soil will do this. Right? It's going to alter the pH of the tank, and that can be a pro, creating more hospitable environments for certain species of fish or shrimp. And these free-floating nutrients also are going to go into your mosses or your epiphytes, creating better overall health for them. The third pro that I've found with Aqua Soil is when it's new sometimes, but as you start to use it and it kind of degrades into that sort of mud as it breaks out of its sort of casing or shell out of those molded balls, I've found that I will start to get what I believe to be the anaerobic bacteria building up in the lower layers of the substrate. Now I say this because as it starts to degrade, you'd think that, the pH would go haywire and the water quality would just skyrocket and go crazy, and I'd have nitrates and nitrites, but I found that to be actually the opposite case. As plants grow in and it breaks apart the substrate, it starts to compact down a little bit in the lower layers and break apart, and I believe that creates a lack of oxygen in those lower layers, allowing anaerobic bacteria to start to colonize. Now, as far as negatives go with aqua soil, there's only really a few. The first being you're kind of locked in with which color of substrate you're going to use, right? You're mostly going to have kind of a blacky brown, maybe red. Like, the only one I can think of is maybe a fluorite red. You're going to have that red color. But other than that, you're pretty much locked in with black, brown, that sort of color. Another negative is obviously aqua soil. I already previously mentioned it, is it does change the pH of the water slightly. Now, I wouldn't consider this too big of a negative. Most of the time, anything that you get is going to be fine with that slight pH adjustment. However, if you are keeping more delicate fish, it is important to keep that in mind when using it. Now you're sitting there and you're thinking, Zach, you haven't really given us your opinion too much, and you've just kind of listed what happens with all of these substrates. So you might be asking yourself, so what do I use? Personally, I like to go with a mix. You're not limited to just one substrate. You can use any of them in any combination that you can think of, right? A lot of people like to use nutrient-based things like aqua soil or fluorite, or I like to use topsoil, along with a capping layer, which is sometimes sand, sometimes gravel, whatever you can think of, right? I really love this mix, and I'll give you guys a few reasons, right? So the first is, obviously, you're getting the nutrients with the substrate inside of it, aqua soil, topsoil, fluorite, whatever it is, you are getting those nutrients and they are being locked in, right? When you put the sand on top, it locks it all down, so you don't actually have as much free-floating nutrient in the water from the substrate. You still have it in the water itself, however, you're not having too much come up into the water column. Another great reason to do multiple substrates is it does increase the area of your substrate, right? So if I do aqua soil, sand, and then I do some finishing with gravel on top, I'm still going to get the anaerobic bacteria down in the sand. However, I've increased the surface area total of the substrate by adding in the gravel, which allows for more aerobic bacteria, right? This creates more room for bacteria colonies, which in turn is going to help benefit you and keep your aquarium much more fresh and healthy. So that's everything that I've got to talk about on substrate today. Hopefully you found this helpful. Maybe you just found it interesting. Maybe you learned something new about some of these substrates. But if you guys did enjoy, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.